to summarize, right, what we saw last time was we looked at a couple of examples, right? So we were basically trying to understand the why and how of ethics not being followed despite so many solutions being available, right? So and we looked at a bunch of different cases, right? So we saw surveillance capitalism and why, essentially how also does an incursion into private spaces, gets people habituated, right? And eventually, however, and also how it circumvents regulation, but eventually the goal is to influence consumer behavior, right? To influence consumer behavior towards influencing consumers to buy different products, right? So that it eventually leads to profit for the companies behind this. We similarly saw why governments also like to indulge in surveillance. And right, so here we saw the idea that governments typically see people less as citizens, more as populations, and populations then which need to be controlled, right, and coordinated. And here we saw many examples of information being used, of course, but even beyond information, in general, how governments come up with schemes which are very top down in nature and which essentially try to impose some kind of a formality on the population. Now, this also has failed quite a bit, and we looked at what James Scott calls metis, right? Basically, practical knowledge, which is very informal. And very often, therefore, these top-down schemes which are imposed, they typically fail to bring the kind of benefits that they claim they would be bringing. That we saw that in the context of Aadhaar, for example, even in greater formalization of the economy that is being brought so that it opens it up for new capital markets, right? So this sort of helps us understand how both capital as well as the state try to come up with top-down policies and essentially impose systems on the world, right? And ultimately, this is being done so that it benefits them. It's not so much from the standpoint of benefiting the people in general, right? So it's not done so much from the point of view of what benefits the users or the citizens, and which therefore also reduce the prerogative to be more ethical in their functioning. Right. So we saw some of that, and ultimately all of this also strengthens bureaucracies, right? So there is a entrenched reason for bureaucracies to resort to using such technologies because it ultimately puts them in a stronger position to impose rules and essentially to govern the rest of the system. Right now, in the same way, we also looked at the gig economy. And here again, we see similar kinds of reasons that the concept of platforms being projected as neutral spaces, which are essentially just matching buyers with sellers, consumers with companies, and so on, right? That is actually not such a neutral view, actually, because the platforms internally are preferring one stakeholder to the other. The platforms are also benefiting in the process. And this is especially seen in the case of the gig economy, where again, it's projected as being income enhancing for the drivers, for example, in this case. But actually, there are very deep exploitative processes that are actually operating, right? Which are essentially all about sucking surplus value from the labor of the drivers, as Marx has reminded us again and again. And it's ultimately leading to the benefit of these companies. Right. So again, we are seeing that even in the gig economy space, much of the same principles have been followed of technology that is imposed with an idea of controlling users, drivers, populations, so that their behavior can be controlled, so that there's less freedom that they have for various activities, right? So we saw some of that. Same with also big data, and then we looked at social media. And again, we saw similar things that social media, while it is projected as being very democratic and emancipatory, but again, it imposes the structure, the design is such that it allows top-down control to again be imposed, right? Be it by algorithms or be it by users of the platforms who are in more powerful positions, politicians, celebrities, and so on. The government also. So ultimately, the emancipatory vision of social media has also not been realized, right? So we saw, right, of how media power, right, is entrenched, and social media in the current shape and form is not able to counter that, right? So you need different forms of social media to do that, right? So we saw all of this, right? So that of course raises the question that why is nobody protesting against it, right? So here we saw the role that public discourse plays, right, from creating technology as an aspiration that people want to acquire, And that's done through movies, that's done through visions weaved by politicians. So essentially the discourse, right? The way the technologies are projected, the way these systems are projected, that plays a big role in actually building essentially what are incorrect perceptions about the usefulness of many of these technologies, right? So we saw these examples, right, where discourse analysis is used as a tool to analyze speeches, and within that, to identify, right, what are common ways in which influence is created, right? So media basically plays a big role over here in propagating essentially this idea of emancipatory technology and so on, but actually it's leading to benefit of corporations or the state or bureaucrats, and like we saw. Yeah. There's also then we discussed, right, that in many cases the technology is projected as being helpful for development, and especially when it comes to ICTs for development. Here the notion of development itself is what is defined by the global north in terms of what constitutes development, and that is also used to push technologies of the global north in places of the global south. So even though different kinds of technologies might be more relevant, if you were to look at needs from a bottom up point of view in terms of what's actually required in these settings, but very often it's actually top down technologies which are imposed, and which is again being done because it benefits companies, corporations, right, which are coming in from the global north. So those are also views that are quite dominant, which help us understand some of the reasons why we see things like smart cities, things like artificial intelligence, and so on being pushed so heavily, right? Because actually there's somebody who's benefiting from these things, right? So this is essentially called critical analysis, critical theory, which persuades us to understand the deeper reasons behind people's actions, behind the actions of institutions, right? Then, right, another in this whole set, right, where we're seeing what kinds of technologies are pushed, then very often we see that the technologies that are pushed are sort of very neutral technologies, right? Not technologies which can challenge the state or which can challenge the entrenched power structures. So things like health, things like education, these kinds of applications are pushed more heavily. And that doesn't necessarily bring what Amartya Sen calls political liberties, which are then very important for people to realize wider freedoms. Right. So the choice of technologies, therefore, is also important over here, that what is being pushed, and these are sort of non-conflict technologies, right? Non-adversarial technologies that can't challenge the existing power structures. Right. So that also helps us understand a bit about why we see certain things being pushed more and more than others, right? So we also saw that the policy, right, influencing policy therefore becomes important, but that also, right, in general, the kind of technologies that are pushed which are very neutral, right? So because they don't engage politically, the people working on these technologies also don't engage politically. So that's another reason why we don't see much of that. Systems that can challenge existing institutions and structures, those systems are not able to prevail. Yeah, right. Yet other mechanics that we saw, that who actually makes these policies, right? So here we see that policies are very rarely taking based on inputs from the mass society, from the people. Rather, it is these power elite, the networks, right, which are formed by politicians, celebrities, CEOs, right? So that's what C. Wright Mills calls the power elite. That it's actually this nexus that is defining policies, that is influencing policies, and within them there are various economics that might be operating, election funding given by companies to politicians, right? So these dynamics are actually what end up shaping policy, rather than policy being bottom up and being done in a democratic manner, right? So all of that basically comes together in terms of, right, not people not taking ethics sort of very seriously, because it's not really about, much of this is not really about what benefits the people, but what benefits some of these stakeholders, right? And that's why David Harvey says that neoliberalism, right, which is basically about importance of the free market, reduce the role of the state and everything, right? So he calls it more of a political project, and which is continuing what capitalism does, which is accumulation by dispossession. That it takes away resources, it takes away power from the people, and all this is basically being accumulated by the elite, by the capitalist class. Yeah. We also saw that now, right? Regulation, right? Same things, that people should be involved in regulations, people should be able to challenge institutions, and there are proposals, right, by the plenty about all this, but it's not put into place. Right, within regulation, we saw that, right, these same structures. An example is in the case of Uber, where different countries, based on the different political context, we see Uber behaving differently, and the regulations, therefore, also catering to these different political contexts. So here again, the way the issues are framed, that defines who's challenging, able to challenge what kinds of aspects. But more broadly, what regulations come into the picture, right, depends entirely on the political economy. In terms of who's powerful, are trade unions more powerful, or right, this government more powerful in terms of taxation, or of consumers projected as being as benefiting a lot, like in the US, from these services, right? So the regulations tend to respond to the political economy rather than sort of shaping the political economy, right? So that's why regulations have also been deficient. So we saw some of that. Right, we've also seen, right, this notion of social audits, where people are actually, the communities are actually auditing the companies. And here we saw examples of the Fair Work platform. But here again, a lot of the success of this really depends upon how aware the consumers are. Right, that are they even aware that these kind of rankings exist? Are they responding to these rankings as opposed to just looking out for their own convenience, for their own benefit? Right. So again, shaping regulations, or shaping company corporate behavior by the consumers demanding more, by the people demanding better processes, that is also a weak process, right? It's not a very strong institution that we see. Yet another way of holding companies accountable is through collective action of the workers themselves, right? And here we're talking not of so much of white collar workers, but of blue collar workers, like in the gig economy space. That are they able to influence their companies for better working conditions and so on, right? Like in Uber, Zomato, and all of these places. And here we see a different set of challenges, because collective action is not very easy. It requires people to come together, but in the case of these platforms, it's difficult for drivers and the workers to come together to organize protests, right? Just because it's a dispersed workforce and it's very individual monitoring processes that companies have imposed, right? So in fact, one way to view this is that platformization is making collectivization even harder, right? Because it's actually dividing up the people, it's atomizing the work processes, so that's making collective action even harder to realize, right? And we saw other problems also with collective action, that in general it is difficult for a large group of people to come together to demand some common objectives, because rarely is there a common objective, right? It's difficult to find some common objectives because different people, different subgroups have different incentives. There's also problems of free riding that come into the picture, because single person's efforts may not make that big of a difference. So that person can actually not engage in collective action, but still they can benefit from collective action as a result of effort by other people. So if everybody starts thinking like that, then it means that the collective action will not be very effective. Yeah, right. So that's sort of what we covered so far. And that brings us to now what we want to cover today, which is about what counter actions, counter movements are coming up these days. Yeah. So that they can shape the political economy, right? So that they can counter that. So many, right, like we've seen through the course, right? So many solutions are known, but the political economy is critical, that many of these solutions are actually not applied. So there are all these fantastic large counter movements which are coming up in society today, right? So one is this notion of platform cooperatives, right? So here the idea is that instead of Uber owning a platform which is doing this matching between riders and drivers, why can't it be a cooperative of drivers, right? Cooperative, I'm sure you understand, right? A cooperative means that all the workers are owners of the enterprise, and they collectively make the rules, they collectively decide what are the wages, what are the payment rates, what working conditions, and they make their own policies, right? So the idea is that here you do not have a separate owner who is a capitalist, right? Who wants to take away your profit, who wants to keep that profit and then decide for themselves, right? How that profit is to be used. Should it be distributed? Should it be used to fund market expansion? Should it be used to kill competition? Whatever, right? That's sort of the logic of accumulation of capital in capitalism, right? That you accumulate profits and then that accumulated profit you can use in different ways. So with cooperatives, the idea is that you might still accumulate profit, but the workers are the ones who are deciding how that profit is to be used. Or potentially you're not even accumulating profit if you're trying to work with a cooperative model that is also benefiting the consumers equally. Yeah. So there have been some interesting successes that in certain cities, taxi driver cooperatives have been formed. They've built their own technology, right, which is not a very difficult platform to make in terms of right matching ride requests with the drivers. And these now have claim now that they're able to provide better wages to the drivers, and the drivers are more in control, right? Which they weren't as part of if they were working for Uber, right? So this is one kind of a movement that is coming up and getting more and more popular, right? Some of the challenges though, right? Now the problem is that ultimately you're operating in a competitive space, right? Because a cooperative ultimately has to compete with other companies like Uber in this case. And Uber and so on, as we know, they give heavy discounts. How are these discounts funded? They're ultimately funded by investors, and it's all being done from a market expansion point of view. So for cooperatives to even survive, to be able to even match some of these discounted rates, it becomes very difficult in terms of just access to capital, right? So try watching this video. It's a concept called venture communism, right? So what it basically says is that how can these platform cooperatives or cooperatives in general, how can they raise enough funds? And so one way in which they envision this is that these cooperatives, they are essentially co-funding one another. So it's like a network of cooperatives. So some cooperatives, for example, we know that Amul is a cooperative, right? Similarly, actually, more workers in the world are a part of cooperatives than actually workers working in commercial corporate companies. That's what some of the stats that are shown over here in this piece of work, that's what these stats claim. So I don't know how correct that is and how it was calculated. But the idea is that there are already some very successful and large cooperatives. So what this movement is saying is that all the cooperatives of the world should unite together, right? So cooperatives like Amul, cooperatives like Mondragon Corporation in Spain, and such similar cooperatives, right? They should come together to fund other cooperatives like platform cooperatives. And so essentially the model over here is that the cooperative movement will grow so big and so large that it will eventually be able to counter capitalism. Yeah. So that it will rely less and less on raising venture funds from capitalists to expect a return, but rather it would raise funds internally from this network of cooperatives, and through that it will gain more and more of the market and eventually sort of squeeze out capitalism, right? So that's sort of one way in which people think. This concept of venture communism tries to think. There's also this very interesting terminology that they introduced, that we need to work with a strategy of counter anti-disintermediation, right? So this is complicated, right, word. If you just read it as such, it makes more sense if you put brackets, right? So the way to think about it is that technologies like the internet, right, they were basically technologies of disintermediation, in the sense that earlier media companies had a strong authoritative role. They had centralized power, and they could act as intermediaries between, right, content providers and consumers. So the internet sort of evened out the space because the internet, right, so it disintermediated this centralizing role that some of the people could play, right? But then with the internet itself, we have seen that we are now back in the era of centralization, right? Because of cloud computing and the way internet economics have evolved, it is again companies like Google, companies like Facebook. So there's a lot of monopoly, right? So this is what Kleiner calls anti-disintermediation. That the internet, which did bring about disintermediation, right? There is now anti-disintermediation that companies like Google and others have brought in. And therefore, what we need is a counter to this anti-disintermediation, right? And so what is this counter movement? So this is where they bring in concepts of venture communism, that companies form through cooperatives instead of funded by investors and so on, need to become larger. Even the nature of the technology needs to change, that rather than working towards centralized systems which require more resources, we should try to work on more distributed, decentralized systems. So they give some examples of some of these, right? And we've broadly discussed, right, building something like a decentralized Facebook, decentralized Twitter. So there are several projects now. None of them have been very successful or popular. Again, because cooperatives, right, don't have enough funding to employ people and to build these platforms quickly enough, fast enough, with good user experience. So that's why consumer migration to cooperatives has not really happened much, right? But essentially, it's about confronting that cooperatives might have a better vision, but they face this challenge in countering, right, in operating in the current economy where they have to challenge and entrenched capitalism, which is very big already, right? So it's difficult to displace, right? Another argument, similarly, about problems that cooperatives face comes from this paper called Entrepreneurial Activism, which basically says that cooperativism is not purely voluntary, and it also, because it has to compete with capitalism, it will end up taking the same form of capitalism, right? So it will have to compete in terms of, it will have to expand markets, which means that cooperatives will also need to carve out profits, which means they will end up exploiting consumers or their own workers so that they can make a profit, and then they will need to use this profit for market expansion, because only then can they counter capitalism, right? So, and similarly, right now, for cooperatives therefore to function, so if you remember, Rosa Luxemburg criticized the popular narrative of the Soviet Revolution, that right, the popular narrative is that the Soviet Revolution happened spontaneously by workers all over the Soviet Republic at that point, and what became the Soviet Republic, right? So she says that, well, actually, it was a very top-down movement, which was well coordinated by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. And so again, with cooperatives, there is a similar idea that cooperatives also internally tend to be very authoritarian, right? Because they need the workers to work in a particular way. So it's not solution as such that workers have more power, right? Because there will be in different internal dynamics, which will bring back and take away the freedom and bring back authoritarian structures. So that's essentially an argument that cooperatives, the form of cooperatives alone, will still not entirely succeed, and because it'll take up the same characteristics that capitalism takes in, right? So there is also this concept called the enterprise society that Foucault introduced, and which echoes over here, right? So the idea is that what capitalism is essentially doing is that it is modeling, it is valorizing entrepreneurs, it is valorizing in the name of risk taking and to try out new things. Ultimately, it leads to thinking about people who need to come up with new ideas and to expand, right? But so it valorizes, right? So this is called an enterprise society, that it tries to build up this vision that each and every person is an entrepreneur, each and every person needs to be enterprising and so on, right? But actually, in practice, what this basically comes down to is that you end up tricking other people. You end up through various crafty means, and which we've seen, right? Ultimately, how it benefits, right? That it's all about growth. It's about increasing your own market share, your own power. right? So it's a vision that gets created, which becomes an ideology, right? So what Sandoval basically says is that cooperatives cannot move away from this ideology because they need to embrace the same ideology. So that's one of the challenges with the cooperative movement, right? So that's that. So while this is a strong counter movement coming up of cooperatives and of networks of cooperatives that can potentially challenge capitalism, but it's not that straightforward, right? Another movement is the commons movement. So this is again very, very interesting. So what this says is that, so it's different from cooperatives. Here the idea, the emphasis is more on voluntary labor. Emphasis is more on sharing of knowledge rather than keeping knowledge entrenched so that only you can benefit, or some entity that owns the knowledge can benefit, and then it rents out the knowledge or the products built on this knowledge to other people, right? Now, so this is a table, right? Which, so on the y-axis over here, you have whether something can be divided, that, right, or what are called rivalrous resources, that if you divide these resources among people, will the value reduce? So intellectual property, for example, is non-rivalrous, that even if more and more people have access to this, they'll be able to do new things with it. So it will lead to improved productivity, right? But property, for example, is a rivalrous resource because it's finite. You divide a property and other people have less access to it. And similarly, another access is excludability. That is, it even possible to exclude, or is it not possible to exclude, right? So now in today's society, the idea is that a lot of the work that we do is not so much of material labor but immaterial labor. So we are all engaged in the production of knowledge, or production of intellectual thought, right? Through software, through books, through research, and this is what is actually leading the world forward. So this is called immaterial labor, right? Labor for which is producing some of these immaterial goods. And this actually occupies space where there is low excludability, right? And similarly it is non-rivalrous. That the more people that have access to the knowledge commons, the better it will be. And this, then many people say that the digital commons or the knowledge commons can be a strong lever to eventually move towards communism, because the world is depending more and more on knowledge these days, and knowledge wants to be free. Knowledge wants to be openly accessible. Only then productivity will enhance. Right. So this is of course difficult because we are actually seeing capitalism react in a different way. So for example, with the emergence of monopolies, what's happening is that companies like Google, for example, they have access to so much of data, so much of knowledge, so much of research, right? And as you know, Google is expanding from one domain to another, and similarly, many other companies are following the same trajectory. So essentially, the idea is that they have access to more and more of this knowledge just within themselves, and therefore it reduces their incentive to try to want to use knowledge in other people might have, because they are essentially getting access to more and more of the knowledge resources. But still, that said, the point is that we are moving towards an economy. We already are in an economy that puts a lot of emphasis on knowledge, and knowledge wants to be free. So another strategy that is coming up is that how do we build this commons movement, right? Which is emphasizing on open knowledge, and that can possibly counter the tendencies of capitalism to try and put boundaries, to try and possess more and more for the capitalists, and through which they can make profit by renting out the knowledge of products built on this knowledge. So sort of similar to how cooperatives, the network of cooperatives wants to become larger and larger so that it can counter capitalism. We have some similar thinking even in the space of digital commons. So now you know about the open source movement, right? Where, right, you know about licenses like GPL, GNU Public License, right? Which essentially says that we'll put software in the open, and then if anybody else makes any improvements or changes on the software, they also have to release it in the open, right? So this is sort of a way of creating the knowledge commons. that you build something, you put it in the open, and you're attaching a license to it, which is saying that anybody else who also builds upon it is also keeping their contributions in the open. So gradually the commons, right, these products which are in the knowledge commons, they will grow and they will also improve because more and more people are contributing to it. And they will eventually be able to counter proprietary technology. So that was Richard Stallman's vision when he came up with the concept of GPL. Now, however, this vision has not been realized fully. So, for example, the vision is called free and open source software, and both these terms mean something very specific. So, free means that knowledge wants to be free and it will only be free if it is able to counter proprietary software. And open means that other people can also contribute to it. And there are two different ways in which now this has evolved, right? So the Linux movement, right, that doesn't care so much about whether the software is used for proprietary purposes or not, right? So it doesn't prevent companies from using the software and benefiting from it, right? Which essentially is almost tantamount to saying that the labor of volunteers who contributed to Linux and so on, has essentially been taken over by the companies, right? So even without paying the volunteers who built all this open software, the companies have commercialized it and they are benefiting more from it, right? So, right, whereas Richard Stallman was against this, he said that the reason you want to be open is so that you can eventually move towards freedom, so that you can eventually free yourself of the clutches of proprietary software. So, so new licenses are coming up now. So there's something called the pure production license, which basically, right, tries to bridge this gap that the GPL basically says is too relaxed, right? So this is called GPL is called a copy left license as opposed to copyright where you own the knowledge, right? GPL is called a copy left, and pure production license is called a copy far left license. So what this is basically saying is that the software can be used for free, and software can be used by other companies for their private gain, but in case they do not contribute anything back, right, either they can contribute in kind by improving the software, or they should pay the volunteers or anybody else in case they are not contributing to the software. Yeah. So that's what they call the peer production license. And here again, the deeper thinking behind this is that knowledge which is released as part of, right, under the peer production license, for example. Now, this is knowledge in the commons, and they want this commons to get bigger and bigger. But how will the commons get bigger and bigger, right? Ultimately, the commons needs to sustain itself, because right, the engineers working on it need a salary at the end of the day, right? Need some wages for survival. And right, so where will this source come from? So this resource can come from the non-commons, right, from the market. If the market, right, and if the market wants to use this particular product built by the commons, then it should pay the commons. So that's what the peer production license is saying, that either you grow the commons by contributing your knowledge into the commons, or if you're not contributing your knowledge into the commons, then you at least help sustain the commons. You pay so that you can sustain the commons, and through that the commons will build more and more knowledge and get into the self-perpetuating cycle. So this is another way to sort of think about it. And the way it moves away from the cooperative movement is essentially by saying that there are in the cyber space, we have seen that open software movements have been very non-hierarchical. So it did not require any structure that cooperatives typically require to manage themselves. All of these have been very organically forming networks, and there is very strong evidence that that can actually happen. That even without imposing any control, many software engineers can come together and build very good, very high quality software. And if you are able to use this software to build more and more value, then you will keep growing the commons, and eventually the commons might get so big that it will be able to counter proprietary knowledge, which is what the rest of the capitalist ecosystem is actually producing and keeping for itself. Yeah. So this is sort of the vision behind the commons, right? There's this, it's quite complex though to realize, because, for example, so I'll come back to this. People, right? There's case studies that have been done of, right, successes and failures of this movement. right? So with Microsoft, for example, when Linux was coming up around the same time, Microsoft was also hit by a lot of antitrust regulations because of Internet Explorer, and it had to open up APIs for third-party developers to build on Windows. And the growth of Linux basically coincided with this because Microsoft was under so much of antitrust regulation. It became more open to this concept of open source software, and it also contributed a lot to Linux, right? So it was essentially contributing its own resources to building up this knowledge in the commons. So it wasn't just volunteers building it, but it was companies contributing also, companies like Microsoft that were contributing to strengthening the commons, which is otherwise very counterintuitive, right? Because why would Microsoft fund its own competitor? Right? But there was a context to it, right? So the point is that this growth of the commons, so these three case studies show different contexts in which the commons have grown. Right? So over here, the commons are able to grow, benefit from their own competitors, but there was a larger context behind it, right? Right. Similarly with Red Hat, right? So what Red Hat, and now as you would know, Red Hat has been bought by IBM. But essentially, what Red Hat did was it tried to create a structure so that contributors of the open source, who were people who were contributing, could benefit monetarily. And Red Hat basically took on the role of helping adoption of this open source software to be more easier by providing support services, documentation services, and so on. So while this has been passing value back to the commons, but this hasn't again led to any vision of the commons getting more and more popular, because ultimately, while the commons are getting paid, the people contributing to the commons are getting paid in some way, but the people using the technology, right, they're still using the technology for capitalist purposes. So it's sort of in doubt as to how is it really helping, because it's not really changing the world, it's not really countering broader political economy that it wanted to. And right, this study from Oracle paints a different picture. That Oracle, when it bought Sun Microsystems, so Sun had put out many of its platforms in the open. So the Solaris operating system, it put it out in as Open Solaris. Its database was MySQL, and it built Open Office, and these were all in the open. But when Oracle purchased Sun, it basically started closed sourcing many of these products. It stopped. It basically built some other proprietary structures on top of it. And many of the developers, right, who were even a part of Oracle at that time, they basically walked out, and they forked the current open version of Open Solaris, and now and then they built something called Open Indiana. So MySQL is now MariaDB. Open Office is now LibreOffice. So this was sort of showing the evidence that the people who are working as part of this commons movement can sometimes also find ways to impose themselves, right? To challenge the structures, right? So the point is that these case studies give you different pictures of how this movement of the digital commons is actually a complex movement, right? It faces contradictions, and it's sensitive to the context in which it is evolving. Yeah. So while it is a very strong philosophy of how the digital commons can be created and grown, nurtured, but in practice it is also quite complex. Yeah. Right. There are some other perspectives also of looking at it. So, or maybe let me skip this for now. Yeah. So what Fuchs, for example, says is that this commons-based production is not truly possible until we have a completely commons-based society. Because only when consumers also want the same thing, they're driven by the same values, only then can some of this really become more and more powerful. Right. So it's again, right, the way this will evolve is may not be very straightforward, right? And so some people have envisioned that to have commons movements, right, not just in the digital commons space, but also with in terms of access to food, in terms of agriculture, in terms of use of the land, and these are some very interesting philosophy of how communities can embrace these values of mutual support, of volunteerism, non-hierarchical work arrangements, and they can, right, not just in terms of knowledge production, but also in terms of material production. and grow that as a possible counter to capitalism. So there's some thought that has been put into how this could be realized. Right. And now, so in a similar way, right, we've been talking about knowledge commons and all of that, right? Even in terms of data, we know that data itself is now, especially with artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? Data itself has increased in the value of data itself has increased to build some of these tools, right? So there are also similar movements that how can people have more control over their data, and similarly how can commercial exploitation from this data be curtailed, be reduced. So there are concepts like data trusts and data cooperatives that are being formed these days. So data trusts are basically like a entity which is driven by more open governance principles, and your data is basically given to the data trust. The data trust then figures which company this data can be licensed to, right? How is it being anonymized, right? They can use differential privacy and various other things to restrict access to this data. The data cooperative is a similar concept where instead of handing it over to a trust, which is run by some trustees, right? So here this structure is basically run by the people themselves as a cooperative, right? Right. So these are also similar ideas, that these are new institutions that you're creating, so that just like the knowledge commons, you can now possibly build something like a data commons, which again can prevent corporations from, or the state even, from unilaterally benefiting from your data, but rather it's held in this commons and the commons are benefited through this process. So any questions so far? Okay, so I'll keep going. Now, right, so we saw how some of these movements are coming up, like platform cooperatives and the commons movement. Another way also to think about this is that sometimes, right, that ultimately you're trying to counter, you're trying to challenge the existing political economy of capitalism, of hierarchical control, right? So you're essentially defining an adversary over here, right? And participatory design has sort of done that in the sense that it tries to empower workers, and right, so that the management cannot benefit unilaterally, right? So another way of saying this, right, and which we've touched upon in different ways in the previous lectures also, is essentially that you ultimately need to embrace some political ideology, right? So in participatory design, the P, they say participation is not just enough, but actually it needs to be done with a particular political ideology. Right, and this is also what we saw when we were talking of concepts from earlier, also as part of design and the modules that we've done. That to really move forward, right, the designers have to embrace a political ideology. So this is sort of saying the same thing. Whenever, right, you're also trying to build technologies, it's not just the designer, but the users and everybody that are working towards it, they have to work with a particular political ideology. So one place where this is done, right? So here are some examples where in certain communication designs, an adversary is identified, and you're basically designing your system to thwart the power of the adversary, right? And then you can sort of generalize this, that as long as you're able to identify an adversary, then you'll be able to build technologies which are built with a particular political motivation to challenge the adversary and to build up this counter power, right? So here's some examples that to prevent child abuse, these kinds of posters are put up, right? But this is sort of like a hologram where at a particular height, a helpline number is visible, right? So the idea is that you have adults walking in the street as well as children walking in the streets, but only the children are able to read that particular number, right? And the adults are not able to read that. So this is one way in which you're sort of, because if the adults come to know, then right, whatever, there are political issues that they can raise and so on. They can start scanning numbers that the child may have called from the phone or whatever, right? But here in this case, they may not even come to know, right? So here the point is that it's a design, it's a technology design, communication design in this case, which is done specifically with the idea, with a particular adversary in mind, that we want to thwart the power of the adversary, and rather we want to do something which is putting more power in the hands of the vulnerable. Similarly, this was another example where on preventing human trafficking, where right, so one version was that such kind of footage was put up in the mass media on right in different languages, helpline numbers and so on were put up at different parts of the city and in newspapers and so on, right? So where it is very visible, where everybody can see that okay, there is a helpline number which is put up and so on, right? Another way, and which turned out to be more effective, was that in menstrual pads these booklets were put, and these are water soluble. So the idea being that when women buy menstrual pads, they will have access to this kind of a helpline information, information booklets and so on, and they don't even need to fear that they might get caught, because these pamphlets are then water soluble. You can just put them in the flush and it's gone, right? So this is another way to think about, right, designing technology when you have a particular adversary in mind and you're specifically designing to prevent that adversary from coming to know or being able to stop use of the technology. So in a similar way, some people call this, right, that we need to build rebel tech, because this is the only way to counter entrenched power structures, right, as opposed to building, let's say, survival tech is where now, right, we're seeing that Uber and these kinds of companies are putting pressure on the workers, and we see a lot of cases where workers find ways to navigate these technologies, right? So by sharing of tips of how they can get better rides or how they can bring back some control, right? But this is called survivor tech, that you're basically reacting to pressures which are being imposed on you, right? And rather, you need to go beyond. You need to think of rebel technology, because only then can you actually oppose these structures which are coming up. So similarly, right, some people have looked at it in a different context, like in a call center. So in a call center, as you can imagine, right, these are sites of very strong surveillance, right? Every response is clogged. The way you're speaking to the customers is measured, right? Automated, right? Speech recognition and various tools are used to even understand, right? Is the customer very angry, or is your response reasonable for the consumers towards the customers, right? So all that is being done, and it's basically very disempowering for the people working over here. But what they saw is that right, actual rebellion has been quite effective, right? Where people working in call centers, they sabotage phone lines. Right? If there is a team meeting, they would unnecessarily like ask questions and stretch the team meetings so that the team meetings take longer. Right? Refusal to stay beyond the required hours. Right? Heavy churn, which also means that the management needs to invest more and more in training new workers, right? So these things was found to be more powerful than formal resistance through unions and so on, right? So again, right, this is another perspective of looking at it. Just like you have the cooperative movement of building networks of cooperatives that can counter capitalism, or the commons movement, especially with the knowledge commons that can become large enough that it reduces the need for closed proprietary knowledge to be built. This is another way of thinking, that you actually you have an adversary and you want to counter the adversary, right? So just a very straightforward counter movement that can come up in many different domains, right? Right, like in call centers or other places. Yeah. So this is basically more in terms of, right. So we've come across Arturo Escobar a couple of times also before, right? Where, right, first of all, we encountered him when he was talking about development itself and how it was actually a Western notion of development, which is essentially trying to again impose its ideologies, its philosophies on the world, and largely to benefit the West itself, or the global North. Right. So he basically says that, well, you actually need very similar to the commons movement, that you need structures which rely on local ownership, local governance, collective decision making, basically more of strengthening of social life as opposed to individualism. Right. Right. So this is quite similar to the commons philosophy that Escobar has also been talking about. Yeah. Okay. So we saw that the commons movement also does face all of these challenges, right? That ultimately it has to navigate capitalism and all of those structures, right? But largely, right, it's driven by this philosophy that non-hierarchical structures can be built, and people can come up with ways to govern themselves, right? So one place where this has been demonstrated very effectively is by Eleanor Ostrom. So Ostrom won the Nobel Prize several years back for work in governing the commons. That what is it that helps people govern themselves so that non-hierarchical structures, and through these non-hierarchical structures they can essentially network with one another and come up with ways to govern themselves, right? So that's the Ostrom's main thesis. And the kind of commons, however, that she is looking at are not the knowledge commons, but more of these common property, right? Which are finite resources like grazing lands, coastal water on which fishing is done. So here the resources are finite, which means that it is a rivalrous resource, but you do not want to exclude anybody in the community from accessing. So it's not so much of the knowledge commons and how non-hierarchical structures are being developed here as part of the open source movement, but it analyzes how commons have emerged in this particular space, right? So the kind of things she finds is, right, that there are some 8 or 9 methods through which this is important, right? So one is that people should be able to monitor one another, right? So for example, what is often done in village commons is that certain people are designated, and this goes on rotation. If let's say somebody is trying to take out more water from a canal, right? So there is constant monitoring of the canal which is being done, right? And they call ditch riders who basically are patrolling and making sure that nobody is taking away more water than they are entitled to. Similarly, sanctions are imposed, right? That there needs to be some kind of a punishment for wrongdoing. Otherwise, free riding will become very popular, and it will reduce the emphasis. It will reduce the effectiveness of the commons, right? Then rules are important, right? Now people are come up with these rules, right, democratically, but rules are important, right? Water provisioning during normal years, that there is some random sequencing which is done so that people, right, are able to benefit. But let's say during times of drought, if this is a canal, then lands which are more upstream in the canal will get more water, downstream in the canal will get less water, right? So some kind of a rationing that needs to be done, some kind of a coordination that needs to be done. So, and rules help in this coordination. Knowledge sharing is required so that people can adapt to the latest technologies. And also from a sustainability point of view, for these commons, it is important to think of future generations, right? So these are some patterns that Ostrom found when she analyzed right, dozens of such commons around the world. What policies the commons had adopted, how people had come up with these policies on their own. So this is one way in which, right, the commons have successfully managed to, through non-hierarchical structures, they've managed to build themselves up. And similarly, in the knowledge commons, we've seen the open source movement and how here also open networks have been, it's been possible to come up with these networks so that people have been able to govern themselves, right? So there's a lot of thinking around. One last element which is also very important, and right, is called appropriate technology. So this concept was brought up by E.F. Shoemaker long time back, and it echoes many of the points we've been talking about, right? Of not imposing development based on notions of the global north, moving away from greed, right? So he also calls it, right, that this is a Buddhist approach to economics, where you want to treat nature sort of as an equal, right? So from an environment point of view, also it's useful. Even from a work satisfaction point of view, the idea is that people want to develop their faculties. They don't want to just be a slave to a machine. So it talks about many of these things in a sort of philosophical manner. But the key point that it basically comes up with is, right, so some of the examples that it provides is basically, right, what it calls small technology, right? So as opposed to large manufacturing units, large industries where people have to work according to processes and are defined by the industry, right? Here, people try to build their own technology, right? And this is now small technology. So the characteristics that they basically he brings for what he calls small technology or appropriate technology or intermediate technology is basically that places where people are living, right? So they build stuff over there itself. They build stuff using local material, using local skills that are available, using raw material which is available locally. And right, so this will help people also build up their own capability, that they're able to build technology on their own, they're able to maintain the technology on their own, as well as the technology which is built that will be very contextual. It will be in line with the local culture, the local needs, and it won't be stuff which is imposed from the outside, because then you basically end up reacting to issues that the technology might be creating. Yeah, right. So things like focus on public works, infrastructure, so that it can have a multiplier effect. So this is also something that the Commons movement suggests, that right, work on building up the strengthening the commons. Could be water, local water resources, could be local forest resources. So any technologies also that you can build that help strengthen the commons. So that's sort of what you should be aiming for. Along with that, Shoemaker also says that knowledge is again important for this. So there should be a communication infrastructure so that people in the field are able to see what kind of needs exist. They're able to communicate these needs to more skilled people so that useful technology can be designed. And all of this therefore can work in building these technologies where the people are involved directly, and it's local material, local knowledge which is also being used in the process, as opposed to, like we know, right, technologies which are built externally and then imposed on the rest of the world by influencing the consumers, or the state mandating use of certain platforms and technologies, right, as we know happens quite a lot. Right. So this whole notion of appropriate technology and small is beautiful has also been very right. So it's been around for a long time, right? Almost 50 years. My own research group, right? We named it Appropriate Computing Technologies for Development Act, with the same philosophy in mind, right? That we don't want to build technology outside. We want to build technology in consultation with the users who are going to be using it. And because unless they are involved, unless they are able to take ownership of how to manage and steer the technology, right, it will lead to various problems, right? And it won't be able to follow the ethical principles that we've been talking about, right? So again, notion of participation that we've repeatedly come upon. So, but this, of course, even though this movement has been around for a long time, it's been difficult. And again, right, so the political economy, as we've seen, that has played a strong role, but we do see it having a resurgence every now and then, right? So sometimes it's seen as being more inferior, right, not being robust enough. Other times it faces challenges of insufficient funding, weak institutional support, right? So all of these are challenges that come up in the process. Yeah. Right. So this is again another interesting case study, right, of appropriate technology in a slightly different context, right, of health systems, of systems which facilitate health-related data collection so that communities can make better health decisions locally. So here they talk about challenges that they faced, and so they build all these systems in consultation with the community. But the systems face a challenge in scaling up, in being adopted with support from the government. So here they talk about challenges at different levels, right? Different organizations, World Bank or local government supporting different players, different stakeholders, central ministry or district administration and so on, having different motivations to adopt the technology as well, right? So these are further things which complicate the adoption of some of these systems like appropriate technology that we've seen. Yeah. So, but yeah, so coming to the summary, right? So essentially what we've seen is, and this is sort of like a summary for broadly, right? That in the entire course, right, what we've seen so far is that, right from user interfaces to data, algorithm, system design, management of technologies and everything, right? And then in terms of design methods to build better technology, in terms of organizational processes to follow better principles within organizations, there's a lot that exists, right? There's a lot that we know of how to do things in a better way. right? But a lot of the success, effectiveness of these mechanisms boils down to the political economy, because that can often be right, that can reduce the effectiveness. It can not ensure that many of these principles are actually followed. And right here there are interesting counter movements which are coming up, right? Interesting visions of platform cooperatives, digital commons, appropriate technology, adversarial technology, right? So all of these are rebel technology, right? So all of these are very interesting ways of thinking, because ultimately we're recognizing that a lot of the success of any of the methods we've studied, that depends upon the political economy, because otherwise surveillance by companies, by governments, exploitation in the gig economy, effectiveness of media and communications, all of that is very difficult to address, right? Because people who right make policies, the discourse, and how consumers are influenced, ineffectiveness of regulation, ineffectiveness of consumer ethics, all of that, right? Problems with collective action in this space, right? All of these are big problems which have had challenges in addressing the political economy, right? So there are some of these alternate movements which seem quite promising, and now we've got to see how it all moves forward. Yeah.